Welcome to today's webinar, Decades of Unregulated Chemical Storage Harm Communities and the Environment. I'm Brian Gum, the Communications Director at the Center for Progressive Reform. The Center is an action-oriented think tank that harnesses the power of law and public policy to create a responsive government, a healthy environment, and a just society. We envision a government that uses the full force of its power to curb climate change and ensure a sustainable environment, economic justice, and healthy workplaces and communities for all. You can learn more about the Center for Progressive Reform at our website at progressivereform.org. Today's webinar will be moderated by policy analyst Darya Minovi. Darya, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. As Brian said, my name is Darya Minovi, and I am a policy analyst at CPR. I'll be moderating and presenting during today's discussion. Our two other presenters are Noah Sachs, a CPR member scholar and professor of law and director of the Center for Environmental Studies at the University of Richmond School of Law. Noah's scholarship focuses on climate change, toxic substance and hazardous waste regulation, and transboundary pollution. We're also joined by Jared Knicley, a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Jared's work focuses on defending imperiled species, protecting communities from harmful chemical spills, ensuring public access to government records on issues of public concern, and enforcing federal clean air, clean water, and safe drinking water laws. To get started, we'll have a presentation from all three speakers and a short Q&A, and then open it to all of you for your questions. With that, I will turn it over to Noah.
Thank you, Darya. I'm going to give an overview of the problem of these unregulated chemical storage tanks nationally. I'll also talk a little bit about Virginia. But to start, I just want to say that this is really an issue that has not gotten enough attention from the media, from the public, and especially from regulators. It's been a bit of a sleeper issue, despite the magnitude of the risk. And so I, in my own work and also in partnership with CPR, we've been trying to call attention to the risks of these chemical storage tanks. Next slide. So what we're talking about are tanks like these, which could be storing any one of thousands of hazardous substances, and that are not regulated by the state or federal government, in the sense of that there's no requirement to inspect them, to repair them, to have secondary containment. And the lack of regulation leaves these tanks vulnerable to damage from here, in this case, Hurricane Harvey. Next slide. Also from other kinds of flooding, and due to climate change, we're increasingly seeing incredibly heavy rainfalls that have nothing to do with hurricanes, like the rainfall that happened in Iowa in 2019. Let's go to the next slide as well. And then there are problems with these tanks that can occur that are unrelated to flooding. For instance, in 2001, there was an explosion at a major tank in Delaware at the Motiva plant that just had to do with a spark from a factory being able to get inside a tank that had known defects and that had not been repaired. This photo that we have on screen was probably the most significant accident involving one of these tanks. This is a photo of the Freedom Industries tanks right outside Charleston, West Virginia. And in 2014, one of these tanks corroded, and it released a toxic material that had been used in the coal industry. And you can see from its location here that the liquid flowed right down the hill and into the Kanawha River. And then just a few miles downstream from here was the drinking water intake for the entire city of Charleston. So when this spill was noticed, there was an emergency shutdown of the water supply. All the hotels and restaurants and bars in the city had to close with massive economic cost, and all the residents had to shift to bottled water. So this is the kind of accident that we are trying to prevent, and to lobby for increased regulation with these tanks. Next slide. Within 3 or 4 months of that Freedom Industries spill, the West Virginia legislature swung into action, and they passed a law that we think is pretty good in terms of state level regulation. The starting point for any kind of program to address this problem has to begin with an inventory to get a handle on how many tanks we're talking about. And we don't have that number nationally. By looking at what various states have come up with in their inventories, I estimate that we're probably talking about over 1 million of these tanks nationwide. Some states like West Virginia, which do have an inventory, they count about 40,000 tanks just in West Virginia alone. So inventory and registration is step one. Requirements for leak detection, monitoring, and labeling. Yeah, let's go on. An annual inspection requirement by professional engineers. And most importantly, a notice to local governments and to public water supplies if you're operating one of these tanks in a place that's upstream of a source water for drinking water. So this is pretty good legislation. And since it was passed, I've been lobbying the Virginia legislature to pass something equivalent. Darya is going to talk a lot more about the Virginia issues. But we've had some good news recently, just in the past week. A bill was introduced on this subject in the Virginia General Assembly by Delegate Lopez. It's HB 899. And it would establish an inventory requirement for hazardous substance storage tanks within the Commonwealth. Next slide. Other states have swung into action as well. Between 10 and 12 states have enacted state-level regulation, which calls for some of the same things that West Virginia has. And so it's not even close to a majority of states, but it's significant. And the reason that states are acting is that there's been no federal action on this problem since 1972, since the Clean Water Act was passed. And the Clean Water Act actually has a mandate for the federal EPA to enact federal regulations on storage tanks for hazardous substances. But the EPA has never acted on that mandate. We still don't have those federal regs, and that's something that Jared is going to talk about more. So in that vacuum of federal regulation, we've seen these states act to address this problem on their own. Yeah, keep going. One more bullet. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some of the gaps in federal law, and I'm going to mention two laws in particular. In the Q&A, I can talk about other federal laws as well and why they really don't address this problem adequately. But the main federal law that should apply is the Clean Water Act, which does have this mandate to the EPA to enact federal rules on hazardous substance storage. But without those rules, the primary thrust of the Clean Water Act has always been to regulate the intentional discharge of pollutants into water. And in the absence of those rules, the Clean Water Act really does not have much to say at all about storing hazardous substances near water, which is the problem that we are focusing on. The federal government and states do have comprehensive regulations for oil tanks, but really nothing equivalent for hazardous chemicals. Next slide. The other federal law that's potentially relevant is EPCRA, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act of 1986. It has different parts of it, and the one that's most well known and most well reported is this orange box, the Toxic Release Inventory, which requires reporting of routine chemical releases to the environment, usually releases that are allowed under state and federal permits. But the part that gets less attention is the green box, chemical inventory reporting. This is where companies have to report to states and to local governments the amounts of chemicals that they're storing on site but not releasing. So that's the crucial distinction. This one addresses chemical storage squarely. And so it's potentially relevant to the chemical tank issues. Next slide. And keep going. But Section 312 really has a lot of problems as a solution for the risk from chemical storage tanks. Enforcement is notoriously weak. Last time I checked, I believe there was one employee in the Virginia state government that was focused on enforcing this section of the Act. This section is really just a disclosure statute. You have to disclose what you're storing on site, but it says nothing about follow-up authority to inspect or to ensure safe storage or to prescribe storage standards for hazardous substances. Next slide. And so when we look at a photo like this, there's a clear risk to communities, and especially to low-income communities and communities of color, that is not currently being addressed by federal law or by state law in most states. And so I want to close on this point that when we look at this problem of hazardous substance storage in tanks, we should get out of our mind the idea that this is only about oil refineries or major industrial facilities, because the fact is that these tanks are everywhere. They're in small towns, they're in bigger cities, they're in neighborhoods, they're owned by light industry, smaller manufacturing facilities. Where I live in Richmond, in the Manchester neighborhood, these kinds of tanks are all over the neighborhood, and quite often across the street from residences. So I'd like us all to keep this kind of picture in our minds as we talk about this problem and not just think about major sites. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. With that, I will go on ahead to my presentation. I'll take over from here and discuss the findings of a report that my colleagues and I published in December on chemical AST regulation, as well as a case study on the hazards posed by ASTs in Virginia. As Noah mentioned, my presentation will focus on those case study findings. So, as Noah discussed, without comprehensive regulation of chemical storage facilities, there's very little data about the number of chemical ASTs nationwide. The Virginia Department of Environmental Quality similarly does not collect data on chemical ASTs in the state. The closest proxy we have for this information is an EPA analysis that estimated the universe of onshore chemical storage facilities that would be covered by a 2018 federal rulemaking on hazardous substances spill prevention, which Jared will provide more detail on later. EPA's analysis concluded that the rulemaking would impact 2,037 facilities in Virginia. Their analysis relied on 2014 and 2015 Tier 2 reports, which are submitted by facilities storing extremely hazardous substances under the Federal Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA. We separately analyzed the 2018 Tier 2 reports and came to a similar result of 2,011 facilities with tanks in Virginia. Nearly 60% of the reported substances at these facilities were listed as contributing to skin corrosion and serious eye damage. 30% were flammable, and a quarter could cause respiratory effects. The map on the right demonstrates where these facilities in our analysis are located. In general, it appears that Tier 2 facilities in the Commonwealth are concentrated in more densely populated areas of Northern Virginia and around Richmond. And it should be noted that each facility may be the location of multiple tanks. However, this approach presents some limitations. First is that Tier 2 reports are submitted by facilities storing a relatively large volume of hazardous substances. So this is surely an underestimate of the full universe of chemical storage facilities in the state. And this analysis is identifying facilities, not the individual tanks. As Noah mentioned, 10 states have comprehensive regulatory programs for chemical ASTs. In order to estimate the number of individual tanks in Virginia, we compared EPA's 2018 findings to states that do register these tanks. EPA's analysis estimated the number of chemical storage facilities for 16 states, 2 of which were Minnesota and Florida, which each have chemical AST registration programs. Based on the Tier 2 reports, EPA estimated that around 5,300 facilities in Florida would be subject to spill prevention regulations. We looked at the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's tank database and found that there are at least 7,100 ASTs that in the state that contain non-petroleum products. Similarly, EPA's analysis found that there are about 3,300 facilities covered by the rulemaking in Minnesota, and their pollution control agency's storage tank database show that there are roughly 8,800 ASTs that contain non-petroleum products. So based on the proportion of active non-petroleum ASTs in Florida and Minnesota compared to the number of tier 2 chemical storage facilities for all 3 states under EPA's analysis, we estimated that the number of unregulated chemical ASTs in Virginia may fall somewhere between 2,700 and 5,400. This range is, of course, a very imperfect approach, as there are various economic and other factors that can influence the number of chemical storage tanks in the state. However, this estimate falls below the number of tanks in Florida and Minnesota, and the known number of petroleum ASTs in Virginia is also lower than the 2 states. So it's plausible that the range, that the number of actual chemical ASTs in the state does fall within this range. In addition to estimating the number of ASTs, we also assessed the number of AST-related spills in Virginia. That same 2018 EPA analysis found that between 2007 and 2016, there were only 12 hazardous substance spills in Virginia, specifically from storage tanks that, quote, reached water from a non-transportation related source. For our assessment, we analyzed pollution reports collected by the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality's Pollution Response Program. These reports are submitted by regulators, citizens, and regulated entities. And our analysis found that between 2000 and 2020, there were more than 1,400 instances of spills, releases, improper storage, and illegal dumping involving chemical ASTs. From 2007 to 2017, the timeframe of EPA's analysis, there were 793 incidents, which is 66 times greater than EPA's estimate of storage tank spills. The map on the right shows the number of AST incidents by city and county. Our analysis found that incidents occurred most frequently in Northern Virginia, near Richmond, in the Blue Ridge region of the state, and in the flood and hurricane-prone Hampton Roads region. There were an average of 11 incidents per jurisdiction, and in general, it appears that incidents occur more frequently in areas where there are a higher concentration of EPCRA Tier 2 facilities. The 7 most impacted cities and counties are home to roughly a third of Virginians. In addition to these AST-specific incidents, there were an additional 3,300 reports referring to tanks only. They were not underground storage tanks, just tanks, and so we couldn't verify them as ASTs, though the descriptions seemed to indicate that was the case. But in total, this amounts to about 4,800 tank-related incidents between 2000 and 2020 to an average of 230 incidents per year. While these findings are highly concerning, they're also likely significant underestimate. Both EPA's and our analysis rely on self-reported data. EPA itself has claimed that their analysis, which was based on National Response Center reports, quote, greatly underestimate the actual number of spills because of significant underreporting. In the case of Virginia, we also came across tank spills covered in news articles that were not even in DEQ's database. Our research also found that the effects of climate change will likely increase the frequency of tank-related spills. A 2012 study identified Virginia as one of 3 US states alongside Louisiana and Mississippi with the highest rate of hazardous substance spills due to hurricanes. Our analysis supports this. In the 10 days following Hurricanes Isabel, Irene, and Matthew making landfall in Virginia, the number of tank-related pollution reports increased 8, 5, and 2-fold respectively compared to the 10 days prior. The 2012 study also found that storage tank spills due to natural hazards released the largest volume of chemicals compared to other facilities and types of equipment, as shown in the figure on the right of the screen. Data also suggest that nationally, hazardous chemical facilities and spills are disproportionately located in communities of color. Studies by organizations like Coming Clean and the Center for Effective Government have found that people of color are more likely to live near high-risk or hazardous chemical facilities than white people. Furthermore, US Coast Guard data suggests that hazardous substance spills from ASTs are more likely to occur in majority non-white counties. Research on underground storage tanks points to a similar trend. Last year, researchers at UC Berkeley developed the Virginia Environmental Justice Map, employing similar methods as Cal EnviroScreen, Maryland EJ Screen, and other EJ screening tools to identify communities that face a high pollution burden and social stressors. Berkeley's map is at the census tract level, so we looked at some of the most notable spills in Virginia on their map and found that they occurred in or adjacent to the most overburdened census tracts in the state, which are shown in dark blue, and the little pinpoints show you where the spill occurred. For example, as shown in the image in the center, in 2008, a tank at the Allied Terminals facility in Chesapeake, Virginia collapsed, releasing over 2 million gallons of liquid urea and ammonium nitrate fertilizer, flooding the South Hill neighborhood, entering the Elizabeth River, injuring workers, and causing many to evacuate. The neighborhood was impacted, the impacted was predominantly Black and has a high concentration of other waste, chemical, and hazardous facilities. And this wasn't even the only spill within that community within a decade. In 2016, there was another storage tank spill of jet fuel in that neighborhood, prompting yet another evacuation. Overall, our analysis and research found that federal analyses are underestimating the number of facilities and hazards posed by unregulated chemical storage. And this lack of data and the number of chemical ASTS and associated spills is leaving regulators in the dark and communities in harm's way. And finally, these hazards that are posed by spills and releases are not equally distributed. Workers and communities overburdened by other environmental and social stressors are impacted first and worst, and climate change will only amplify these effects. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jared. Thank you.
Thanks, Darya. As Darya and Noah alluded, I'll be talking specifically about EPA's decades-long inaction on hazardous substance spill prevention and the work my organization, NRDC, and its partners have been doing to try to compel EPA to finally regulate these important sources of pollution. Next slide. So Congress has, as Noah mentioned, repeatedly and specifically mandated action to prevent hazardous substance spills. In 1972, with the passage of the modern Clean Water Act, Congress required EPA to issue regulations to prevent hazardous substance spills from above ground storage tanks as soon as practicable. And in 1990, Congress again told EPA that it shall issue regulations, this time within 2 years, requiring the most dangerous chemical facilities around the country to develop specific plans for how they would prevent and respond to worst case spills of hazardous substances, including spills during bad weather, and have those plans submitted to EPA for review and in some cases, affirmative approval. The 1972 mandate for general spill prevention regulations, EPA did undertake for oil, but not hazardous substances. And those are known in the oil world as the SPCC regulations, Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasure. And the 1990 mandate in the oil world is known as the Facility Response Plan regulations, or FRPs. Next slide. So in the face of these mandates to act, EPA has done neither. As from the discussions we've already had today, the absurdity of this fact is probably clear. But just a few additional points on why this is so absurd. One is the Clean Water Act defines hazardous substance very clearly. And that definition is that compounds that when discharged into or near water present an imminent and substantial danger to the public health and welfare, including the environment. And EPA has actually designated over 300 chemicals as hazardous substances. Many of them would be familiar to folks on this call: PCBs, ammonia, benzene, hydrochloric acid. And while the list is very under-inclusive and outdated, all of the chemicals on the list are very harmful to health and the environment. And as Darya mentioned in her analysis, and as we, NRDC, has found in independent analyses as well, there are thousands of hazardous substance spills each and every year in the United States from above ground tanks, many, if not most of which, go completely unreported and unnoticed by the agencies and by the public. So with this background, NRDC and several of its partners took EPA to court. Next slide. So the first lawsuit we actually brought in 2015, NRDC, the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, and Charleston, West Virginia-based people concerned about chemical safety, following the heels of the Freedom Industries spill that Noah mentioned in West Virginia. And we sued EPA over its at that time 40-plus year failure to issue general spill prevention regulations to address spills from above ground storage tanks. When EPA resisted and actually moved to dismiss our case, we filed a summary judgment motion showing, using federal government data, that unregulated spills across the United States were disproportionately affecting communities of color. EPA ultimately agreed to settle the case, and in that settlement agreed to take regulatory action by summer 2019. Next slide. So EPA's rulemaking approach, I think, is summed up nicely by this slide. Rather than take a hard look at the problem and address some of the information issues that both Noah and Darya alluded to, EPA rejected its mandate and determined that it would not issue any new regulatory requirements. Next slide. And in particular, EPA admitted that it didn't know or try to learn the most basic information about these tanks, how many there are, what chemicals they store, and what quantity where, with what protections. And EPA instead pointed out to a handful of other regulations that it had issued over the years under various other laws, most of which were irrelevant to justify its continued inaction. And despite protests from the environmental community, environmental justice groups, public health groups, water utilities, drinking water utilities, and emergency response personnel, EPA formally adopted its do nothing rule in September of 2019. Next slide. Between EPA's proposal to do nothing on chemical spills and their affirmance of doing nothing in late 2019, we took EPA to court again. This time, NRDC, Environmental Justice Health Alliance, and Clean Water Action sued EPA over its failure to issue the worst case spill prevention regulations for hazardous substances that Congress had mandated in 1990. This time, EPA didn't fight the case. They settled and agreed to issue a proposed worst case spills rule by this March and take final action by fall 2024. Next slide. Now, the worst case spills rulemaking that's ongoing now has a potential to be really important and a huge improvement. By definition, the rule will apply to the most dangerous facilities storing hazardous substances across the country, those where worst case spills would threaten substantial harm to public health, to water supplies, or to the environment. And these facilities will be required to plan for how they will prevent, respond, and otherwise address these spills, including the worst case spills caused by anything, including foreseeable bad weather. And that would include as well climate-related disasters. In undertaking this rulemaking, we've encouraged EPA to prioritize transparency in information gathering and environmental justice. Transparency to ensure that all stakeholders know the risks stemming from a facility, and that first responders in the event of a spill know what they're dealing with and can respond accordingly. And environmental justice to address the fact that historically communities of color and low-income communities have bore the brunt of pollution from these facilities, and they continue to do so today. But this rulemaking won't be a panacea because it specifically will only apply to the biggest, worst facilities. It won't address all of those facilities like those that Noah mentioned that are the medium size or the light industry facilities across the country, or the single tank facilities. And EPA, to address those harms and the harms from those facilities, it really needs to revisit its do nothing rule and actually set baseline spill regulations for all storage tanks. And in doing so, consider expanding its list of hazardous substances as well to catch up with the times and update a list that hasn't been updated since the 1980s. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Jared. All right, so with that, I see that there are some questions over in the Q&A, but to, pardon me, to start, I just wanted to ask the speakers one question before we get going. Noah and Jared, if you might each be able to answer, if you want to go first, Noah, how do EPA and states inaction on regulation of AST compared to other significant failures by agencies and policymakers to safeguard the public from chemical disasters?
Yeah, if you look at the arena of toxics regulation more broadly, you see examples of delay all over the place. Some that I'm aware of involve like revisiting pesticide tolerances, where there was a decade-long delay between the statute and the regulations. But this one really stands out for being a 50-year delay. I think it's inexcusable. There's been no good justification for it, and this is a pretty serious risk.
Thank you, Jared.
Yeah, I echo Noah's sentiment. It's I can't think of anything quite like this where the agency has. I mean, it's not just a delay at this point. They've affirmatively said no to something Congress told them to do, which is unprecedented in my mind. The one example that I can think of that's fairly recent is under RCRA. EPA has an obligation to review and update all of its regulations every 3 years. Congress included that because operations at facilities change, the kind of chemicals that are being used change, the science about, or not the science, but the what we know about what these chemicals do to our bodies and to the environment change over time. And it was imperative, Congress made it imperative on EPA to keep up with the times and make sure regulations are being protected. And in my experience, EPA has largely ignored that mandate to keep up to date on its RCRA regulations in a similar way as what they've done here. And in some cases, for certain types of pollution, like pollution from oil and gas waste, have waited 30 years to do a mandatory review.
Thank you. All right, so I'm seeing if you have questions in the audience, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A and we'll go through. I see there are a few in here. All right, so let me just go through the list. Scott Eustace at Healthy Gulf, can you talk about engineering standard requirements for oil storage or other stormwater projects? Are tanks supposed to be engineering to withstand the 25-year storm or the 100-year storm? Thank you. Either of you want to take that one?
I can't speak to the specific engineering standard requirements. I mean, the under the oil spill regulations, where there are requirements in place at the federal level, I think the general standard is good engineering practices, and that changes over time. I think ideally we would have tanks would be engineered to withstand foreseeable storms with a margin of error for additional safety. I don't think that's what is functionally happening or required in all locations across the United States, but I think that's what the goal should be.
And I also don't know about the engineering standards for the tanks, but one thing I've been pushing for is for elevating tanks in areas that are flood prone, places like Hampton Roads or places that are right along rivers, to withstand near-term flooding and also sea level rise over time. And just to follow up on an earlier point about RCRA, so RCRA is another one of those federal laws that's potentially relevant to this issue. It does have comprehensive standards for storing hazardous waste, labeling hazardous waste, transport of hazardous waste, and it is the law that set up the underground storage tank program. But the problem with RCRA is it only applies to wastes and has a lengthy definition on what wastes are. And primarily what we're talking about with this problem is chemicals that are in storage because they're serving some commercially useful purpose. They're part of manufacturing and they're not yet declared a waste by the companies that are using them.
Thank you both. I see a question here. Do you have information about Illinois? Illinois was one of the few states that does have regulations for flammable liquids only in ASTs. There's more information about that in our report, which was linked in the chat. So if you want to take a look, there might be more information about Illinois regulations specifically in there. That's unless others are aware of another resource. I mean, you could check out the state's environmental agency as well. All right. Charles asked, I want to confirm the prior slide stated that an AST incident equals a release. When I refer to an incident, I was referring to a release, illegal dumping, improper storage. So any situation where ASTs might be released or are not being stored in the correct manner and can harm public health. But largely, yes, those are referring to releases. Do you have reviews or links? Yes, they are in the chat. All right, from Will, has Professor Sachs or CPR NRDC developed a detailed proposal for what they would like the Biden's EPA draft rule to look like from a policy perspective? Or is the plan to see what they come up with in the March 2022 rule and comment accordingly? Relatedly, does anyone have a sense of whether the Biden team is open to revisiting the do nothing rule? Thanks, Will from Governing for Impact. I don't know if you want to take that first, Jared.
I'd say my clients, including NRDC, we have ideas of what we'd like to see in the role from the Biden administration. But right now, we're primarily waiting to see what they're proposing and going to respond accordingly. There have been no public indications from the Biden administration that they're reconsidering the do nothing rule.
Thanks. Anything to add, Noah?
No, nothing to add on that one.
Okay. From Cheryl, can someone talk about spill notification? We recently had an issue where a company discharged oil and they did call it into the NRC and our state DNR, but they did not notify our city, port, water utility, and any local stakeholders. We found out after 4 days when oil started reaching downstream waters where people lived.
Yeah, so this is another example of federal and state law that is widely under enforced. The law requires notification to the National Response Center and to the state. But unless it's a major spill or unless there's been fatalities around the spill, usually there's no enforcement of that requirement. As for getting down, I think your question was more about the neighborhood level and notification to cities and towns and neighborhoods. There's no requirement in the law to do that. It's a real gap because this is about community right to know about the chemicals that are stored within your community and then the releases that occur. So in terms of changing that, I would look to working through state government to change that. The states are always free to add further notification requirements or to work with your city government.
Thank you. From David, he shared an image of 2 uncovered tanks at a landfill, and he says, how would I find out what's in those? To add to that, that's a similar question along those lines for you, Noah, of sort of, you could help illustrate, you showed some photos, but just sort of like, what does this look like on the ground? What types of chemicals are being stored? How do you find out what's in them?
Yeah, I haven't clicked through to the image. Are these abandoned tanks?
Perhaps at a landfill, perhaps, maybe.
Yeah, so I would write to your state environmental agency and to your local environmental office if there is one. If they're not abandoned, if these tanks are currently in use and they're currently storing chemicals, then they should be filing these tier 2 reports annually with the local and state government. And the public has access to those. So I've been through this process in Virginia where we wanted copies of these reports, and we filed a FOIA request, and it was difficult, and it took over a year to get the documents, including the involvement of attorneys and a threatened lawsuit. And what I'd like to see state and local governments do instead is to just make this much more easily publicly available on the internet, so that the public doesn't have to go through FOIA, and so that you could just look up, here's a tank, here's the address that it's at. I have a right to know what is in it under that 1986 law that I mentioned.
Thank you. Jared, I had a question for you. So as you mentioned, that worst case spills rulemaking would apply to storage of hazardous substances, which includes about 800 chemicals. What about chemicals that aren't covered? Are there contaminants stored at these facilities that aren't defined as a Clean Water Act hazardous substance?
Yeah, there are, and it's one of the limitations of the worst case spills rule, that if EPA does issue one, even a strong one, it wouldn't necessarily cover all of the pollutants that we're worried about. I think one good example is PFAS. They're not currently designated as a hazardous substance under the Clean Water Act. And even though EPA has taken steps to designate certain types of PFAS, specifically PFOA and PFOS, as hazardous substances under CERCLA, that designation doesn't actually carry over to the Clean Water Act context. And so a facility solely storing those chemicals, even large amounts of those chemicals, just wouldn't be covered by the rule. And it isn't really unique to PFAS. EPA's delinquency in updating its hazardous substance list has been going on for 40 years now, and they've only updated for a handful of chemicals since the 1980s. And another example of this is the 2014 Elk River disaster that Noah spoke about. The MCHM that Freedom Industries spilled into the Elk River, and then which cut off water for hundreds of thousands for a week, was clearly toxic, but it wasn't listed as a hazardous substance. So even if EPA had done its job and issued spill prevention regulations without also updating the list of chemicals that are covered as a hazardous substance, that facility wouldn't have been covered either.
Thank you. Noah, I think you might be a good one to take this one on. So from an attendee, how will environmentalist efforts to change public policy on the issue of toxic waste storage be impacted by the recent changes in Virginia's political climate as a result of the November 2021 election?
Yeah, great question. There's no doubt we're facing stronger headwinds now than the situation where both houses were controlled by Democrats and we had a Republican and a Democratic governor. The news about appointing Andrew Wheeler as Secretary of Natural Resources is also troubling to me about the direction that this administration is taking. But we're keeping up the fight. We're still working on both sides of the aisle to get something passed in this session. This really should be a bipartisan issue. In fact, one of the early bills in Virginia on this subject it was sponsored by Senator Watkins, a Republican. And that was a study bill back in 2015 that ordered DEQ to study the issue of hazardous chemical storage in Virginia. And so when we're talking about things that can harm children, things that can harm drinking water, things that can disrupt the economy if they're released, this really should be a bipartisan issue. And it seems to be a less partisan issue than, let's say, something like climate change. So I'm optimistic that we can still make progress in the next 2 years.
Thank you, Noah. I think that's a great response. All right, so if you have any questions left in the audience, put them in the Q&A now so we can get them in. But to close, I see these questions from Rose that kind of gets to this. Could each of you answer, how can advocates and agency staff support efforts at the state level, federal level to strengthen regulation of above ground chemical storage? Jared, do you want to take that first? Maybe at the federal level, the EPA?
Sure. I think, and this won't be a surprise to anyone who's been listening this time, for all of us, that the biggest barrier, one of the biggest barriers to adequate and meaningful regulation here is really information asymmetry and the lack of information that we actually have about where these facilities are, what they're storing, what their precautions they're already taking. And I think we need to push EPA and state regulators, and they need to be willing to kind of gather the information necessary to understand the full scope of the problem, so that the solutions can be ones that are meaningful and provide robust protections and just protections for communities that are in need. I think I'll leave it at that.
And at the state level, I know we have folks from all over the country on this call today. So looking beyond Virginia, I would say write to your state environmental agency, find out who the director is, and email them, and get information on what your state is doing to protect the public from unregulated chemical storage tanks. If your state doesn't have legislation, and you can look at the CPR report, which has that map of which states have state level regulation, then I think it's really productive for activists of all kinds to pressure your state legislatures to pass that legislation. You can look to other states like Florida, Minnesota, West Virginia for models. And start pushing this issue, because it only takes a handful of legislators to kind of raise the flag and say, hey, this is something we ought to be looking at before you start getting things like committee hearings and more attention at the state level to doing something. One more thing I'll say about the timing is at the federal level, rulemaking is extremely slow. So I think Jared would agree with me on this. EPA will come out with its worst case rulemaking. It'll be finalized by 2024. There will probably be litigation over that rulemaking, and a court may either accept it or may send it back to the agency for revisions. And the same may happen with the other federal rulemaking that EPA has so far taken no action on. So it's common at the federal level that it takes 5 to 10 years to move through this rulemaking process. And so if you are working at the state level, don't let opponents use the potential federal rulemaking as an excuse. Don't let them say, well, let's just wait. Let's see what EPA does. There's no need for action now. Because the fact is, I think it'll be many more years before there's an EPA rulemaking in place.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And I think too, those state laws are a place to fill those gaps where the federal rulemaking might not be able to cover certain sizes of tanks, certain chemicals, etc. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A box, so I think we can call that a day. Thank you so much for our speakers and for those who joined us today. Thank you, Carolyn. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You'll get an email tomorrow with all the resources that were shared and discussed during today's discussion. There'll also be a recording of the webinar shared. So thank you for joining us. And if you could please fill out that quick survey as you're exiting the webinar, that would be hugely helpful. Thank you.